Hello. Yes. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I would like to welcome you all to the COVID-19 Public Space Talk Series, the third one, which is organized by Eastern Mediterranean University Urban Research and Development Center, in order to provide a virtual discussion platform to share kind of know-how on the future of our cities and public places. We have been having extraordinary days everywhere in the world almost, and somehow the world has got smaller. We can contact, communicate, share our experiences with different people all around. And our intention by organizing these public space talks was to basically share our experiences, not only with our students here in Eastern Mediterranean University, but with everyone. So I would like to start with our third speaker, Greg Griffin, who is an assistant professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Texas at San Antonio. His research is focusing on transportation, public participation, and health. He has over a decade of experience as a professional planner, an Eisenhower Graduate Transportation Fellow. He earned a doctorate degree in Community and Regional Planning at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Griffin's recent work is published in the Journal of American Planning Association, Transportation Research Part D, and in popular outlets including the Chicago Tribune, etc. So thank you, Greg, for accepting our invitation and to be a speaker in our COVID-19 Public Space Talks series. And I will leave the floor or screen to you so that you can share your work with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Askar. This is a real pleasure to get to talk with you, your students, and a global audience as well. So I hope that everybody is in a situation this morning or afternoon and in a state of health and relative comfort, and I wish you all the best. And thank you for joining us. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and we'll get going. Again, the title of this talk is Mobility is Transitioning. Is it healthy or is it equitable? And I wanted to phrase this question in a way that we can have something of use both in thinking right now during our COVID pandemic crisis, but also a little bit long term. And what these changes that are going on right now, both technologically and socially across the world, dealing with all these major changes and how they might impact our long-term future, not just our short-term present. I already got a wonderful introduction, so thank you. I won't go over this, but I am enjoying teaching over at UT San Antonio very much as well. In transportation classes, health planning, and in fall I'll be teaching planning practice and ethics. Professors always need to wear silly hats, right? But we have a wonderful time reaching out. So for this talk today and the concepts that are underlying what we think of as, and I'll introduce three specific ideas that might sort of help ground us in all this change that's going on, and hopefully also set a path towards being able to manage the change going forward, which of course plus urban designers are keen to do our best to be able to provide for the community. The second part focuses on being able to tell whether or not we're making an impact in terms of health or equity, which of course I don't see these transitions as necessarily unidirectional, right? We have challenges all around us, and this moment is a good opportunity to take stock of that situation and to be able to chart a path towards a better future. And then I wanted to leave you all with an opportunity for thinking for now and later. Again, considering how to apply these concepts for both quick action and more structural changes as we head towards many different changes in mobility and our cultures. But first, I'd like to define, what a mobility transition is. And I thought there's really no better way to do that than a couple of images. Mobility transitions deal with both technological and social change in our environment. And so on our left, we see an image from San Antonio downtown, and in 1923, we see a busy streetcar dominated transportation scene where the electric wires that powered our streetcar system throughout downtown and into the suburbs at that time were part of the infrastructure. They were not something that is extremely flexible or changeable, right? It was mounted into the street. It was part of the core of our transportation ways in the year 1923. However, this image is wonderful because it also shows the beginning of a major transition towards an automobile-oriented way of travel. You see cars parked on both sides of the street, even if we have streetcars in the middle and pedestrians all around. And this image, of course, also shows pedestrian dominance that of transportation in America at the time, where people are able to walk wherever it is that they needed to walk, right? If you're in one store, you cross the street, you go to the next store. You don't have to go to the end of the block to find a crosswalk to be able to make that change, okay? The laws relating to crosswalks happen later, focused on improving safety conditions and mobility for car transportation. So on the right-hand image taken in 2017, we see those changes in the same street corner, this time taken from a Google Street View 3D images. And so, of course, we have an auto-dominated scene. There's no visible pedestrians except a couple of folks on segways that were, I think, in this case, part of a downtown tour. So we see a change in the commerce of the city in addition to the vehicles and the infrastructure that serves those type of vehicles. What I want you to take away from this image, which is not new to the viewers of this webinar in many cases, is that the infrastructure, the planning, and the decisions that went on regarding these social and technological changes impacted how easy it is to make changes in the future, right? The rail is gone, the right-of-way has changed, the sidewalks have been altered, crosswalks are there. All of these changes are the physical changes that urban designers and planners work with on an everyday basis. And sometimes that's a focus, and sometimes that is a major structural change that can be hard to impact later on. And of course, the sidewalk widths help dictate how we operate with each other during the time of COVID pandemic as well. So speaking of COVID-19, I wanted to sort of walk through real quickly about different type of transitions that we're seeing and what that might, how that might impact both positive opportunities and potential negative risks that we're seeing right now. And this, of course, is a quick overview, not meant to be comprehensive. But of course, we're seeing telecommuting. We have telepresence at the moment, and this is the best way for us to work together for right now. Of course, that means that there's a wide scale reduction in driving. I looked at air quality data in the San Antonio area, some of that reduction in driving. There's a great deal less negative effluents coming principally from passenger cars, which is our major contributor to both pollution, and our key pollutant is ground level ozone in this area, but then also it's making a larger impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that's potentially a good thing. Of course, that comes with negatives, both in, of course, the economy, because not everybody is able to telecommute, but also in terms of idea exchange. There are thinkers working on some of these issues right now, recognizing that although technology is wonderful to be able to do what we can without physical presence, there is certainly loss of ideas and interactions that we lack in regular office and university environments. To note is mobility as a service. This is this transition where instead of just thinking about a mobility as a physical product, a bicycle, a car, a bus, we're increasingly thinking about having mobility as something you buy, whether that is through ride hailing or ride sharing. A company more often than individuals and governments. So these are some of the larger transitions that are going on. During COVID, of course, we are seeing a trade-off and challenge with public transit, right? Is way down. There are major concerns about financial solvency. At the same time, this comes right after ride hailing and ride sharing. Technological transitions have supported ways to have lower density transportation through, of course, Uber and Lyft, in addition to other services like e-scooters and rent by the minute schemes. Third, of course, all these mobility as a service technological solutions are generating data from the users. Now, that's a great opportunity potentially for contact tracing. So we're leaving a great amount of data that's useful for scientists to be able to look at to understand the movement and spread of COVID-19 in society. At the same time, if it's not properly safeguarded, it opens up opportunities for hacking and misuse of that data as well, either by individuals or from nefarious agents in large organizations. The next, of course, is electrification of our transportation grid, which is perhaps a bit of a return to back to the future, as we look from the streetcar view of San Antonio in 1923. We are seeing opportunities with e-bike transitions, so people are biking more than ever. And at least in the United States, bicycles are hard to come by within shops because of everyone staying at home and not having to go on long trips. They're biking more to be able to do short trips. And e-bikes are a great part of that, particularly for people with physical challenges that they might pose, particularly with hills and other issues where bicycling is not always as good of a solution for some people, in addition to the heat. Also, e-scooters are typically shared, and so most of those services that are provided as a mobility as a service in San Antonio and most US cities, and indeed across the world, have at least temporarily shut down. And so this is a challenge to that transition as well. But we can also look at that transition of those similar technologies as a potential opportunity for e-biking when people buy them, because shared scooters may be less popular as well right now. So there's definitely some challenges going on and in that transition. Perhaps longer term, more broad scaled, we need to think about automated vehicles. Of course, the notion of having, a privately owned automated vehicle offers then a mobility solution with no human contact, which of course has positive and negatives during the time of coronavirus. The big issue from research is that automated vehicles, particularly when they're provided as a service to be purchased as opposed to individual ownership, can cause an increase in overall vehicle miles traveled, which would then, of course, have negative impacts on both congestion and our emissions problems, particularly when we're still operating off of a combustion engine oriented vehicle technology. Okay, so these are just some of the transitions that are going on right now that we have to think about. So how do we think about this more broadly? I'll offer 3 concepts that may be particularly helpful for understanding these mobility transitions within our cities. Those are urban obduracy, socio-technical change, and co-production. And so next I'm going to break these down just a little bit. First, urban obduracy is a concept developed by Anik Hummels, which considers, how firm our cities are and resistance to change. The photo on the right is in Washington, D.C., showing an immediate change in infrastructure to be able to provide more social distancing on what is sometimes a crowded sidewalk. Not necessarily in this picture, but nonetheless, these temporary concrete barriers are taking some of the roadway space to make more room for pedestrians, to make sure that they are able to limit their physical contact and transfer of COVID. So that helps understand some type of a temporary change. That change might have a long-term impact if those sidewalks are widened to be able to support this change longer term, or it might not. That's why I like this image. It's not flagging. It's quite a firm solution, and yet not necessarily permanent. So the 3 underlying concepts that Hummels uses to help understand and evaluate urban obduracy are, first, dominant frames of urban change. How are people interacting with those particular technologies, or as some people say, artifacts in our urban environment? How are their worldviews coming in, and how are those worldviews changed throughout their perspective of these changes in obduracy within the city? And then second, how embedded are the interactions between social groups, whether you're a user of the street, an engineer, a designer, urban planner, and these technical artifacts, so these actual changes in the urban environment? The more firm those social interactions and understandings are, the less likely there might be for long-term change. So the degree to which these different social groups are open to change may impact whether or not some of these changes that we're experiencing during COVID could become more permanent or commonplace. And the third related issue is the persistence of traditions of city building, right? In some contexts, pedestrian travel may be the most dominant and important mode to consider, and others, automobiles might be a challenging tradition to be able to overturn in thinking about what a city needs during COVID-19 pandemic and later on. So urban obduracy is an important way of framing those issues. Second requires a little bit more breaking down, which is socio-technical change. And this is a theory that suggests that major changes happen in our landscapes, not just physical changes, when technological innovations happen at the same time with different components of major social change. And so some of those changes might be economic or political or demographic. And even though we have technological innovation going on all the time, if they're coincident with those major changes, as we see in the image on the right of massive delivery of Amazon packages at this time, then they're more likely to stick, perhaps. So let's take a look at how this might happen through what Giels calls the socio-technical innovation window of opportunity. And I've redrawn some of their earlier imagery. Some of these, I've already explained some of these concepts, but let's break this down a little bit. Up at the top, we see this, the sweeping orange arrows or niche innovations. These are the technological innovations that are happening all the time. And there are multiple phases on the x-axis that show, how they interact with existing socio-technical systems and the broader socio-technical landscape. And so we have a constant process of trial and error that's going on. But when those changes, in addition to people's learning and improvement and support of how those niche innovations and technological improvements actually play a role in our lives, when they coincide with these broader political, economic, and demographic trends as shown in phase 3, it puts pressure on the existing systems, just like we're seeing right now during coronavirus, creating a window of opportunity for these niche innovations. So that's what you see in that phase 3 transition, where some, but not all, of those innovations become part of our long-term socio-technical systems. And so they become embedded in our environment, in our culture, and indeed in our urban landscape as well. But how do we impact that change? Co-production is one concept that's shared with community development and public administration as an opportunity for impacting change in urban planning. And so for those that work in urban planning and think about how we can foster collaborative planning, co-production is a method to recenter a lot of those same concepts towards action rather than focusing on words and language. As shown in the image on the right, that was from Portland, we have community members taking on the role of what might typically be provided by a city or a transportation authority, right? We have a homemade sign and we have borrowed and retransitioned traffic cones to be able to make space for, in this case, kids to play safely when they can't get to a public park, okay? This was developed, this particular image in Portland was done by a PA teacher who wanted to help keep neighborhoods physically active and safe. But let's look at how co-production actually can happen according to research from Vanessa Watson. One is that it can work outside and sometimes against established rules and procedures. So in this way, community members might be working directly with planners and designers, or they might say, hey, you're not doing what needs to be done, and so I'm going to take care of it. And community members can, in this way, nudge change within their own communities. And next, she describes specifically that talk and debate are less a part of this mode of planning, and there's more emphasis on showing and learning by doing. So this has an opportunity to break barriers related to language and background by focusing on action instead of the concept of public meetings and being able to change administrative procedures only. Let's show people how this can work. And then, of course, it can demonstrate this sort of change of through local practices globally, and that can occur, of course, quickly through technology, as we have a role in right now, and then also through other networks that might be more traditional ways of transferring knowledge as well. Okay, but how do we evaluate what these impacts are and actually work towards positive health impacts in the near and long term? These are only 3 different approaches that I'll offer quickly. First, of course, is surveying throughout the disruptions like we're seeing right now. Second is using technology to be able to monitor the change continuously so that you're ready no matter what type of disruption might happen. And then third is to leverage the digital data that's contributed by users, whether they know or perhaps are unaware of, typically with smartphones and other digital methods. Okay, an example of surveying through disruptions is that San Antonio bike share system experienced a major challenge during coronavirus, where they were tourism industry, which has typically very large, has decreased quite a bit due to coronavirus. And so they wanted to know more about what local users need to be able to feel safe and use their system during coronavirus. So I worked with them to develop an electronic survey of local users and focused only on them. We got 114 responses from within the community. And we asked a lot of different questions, but I just wanted to highlight one on how coronavirus outbreak has impacted their use of San Antonio Bike Share. Some have a quarter responded that it actually has increased their opportunity to be able to use the system and that they were actually using it more. Of course, for many folks as well, that decreased. Almost a tenth have stopped altogether because of concerns with coronavirus. And so we also asked questions about what would make them feel more comfortable to be able to change the system for their needs. And of course, they do have a program to clean the stations and bicycles and other things to be able to make sure that it's safe to use. So surveying through disruptions is one opportunity. The second is using machines to be able to monitor activity that has an impact on health. Okay, on the left image, we see a bicycle traffic recorder that's embedded within a path, and this is in Austin, Texas. Okay, so it's recording this information constantly, and many of these are already embedded in our infrastructure around the world. And so one company, EcoCounter, has shared some of the results of that data. And so on the right, we're seeing a graph of a group of days in the country of Spain. And of course, they have other data from others as well. In the gray line shows the use of bicycling along these paths before coronavirus pandemic in typical use. And then the green yellow line shows a huge reduction in trips during the coronavirus pandemic, and then a enormous increase after the pandemic hit its peak. And of course, many countries like the United States perhaps are going into some of our most challenging phases. And so we might look to other countries to learn how we can respond and what those impacts might be. And then that third method that I'll offer is user contributed data. And again, this is digital data. Typically through smartphone use, but also other types of digital traces that on the left side, we see data during we see the highest levels across different countries in Latin America right now, where people are working very hard to stay put at home. And then on the other end of the spectrum, South Korea has been very successful in controlling coronavirus transmissions through early efforts, and so they are able to be a little bit more mobile. And so we see in these data traces the impacts of public policies and also culture as well. On the right-hand side, we can see data from Google's reports that show activity near transit hubs. Okay, so that could be train stations, bus stops as well. And of course, we have a drastic decrease as compared to the baseline that we can see in that sort of data. These are only two different types of data that are nonetheless that are aggregated, but nonetheless useful to help us see sort of macro trends and what's going on related to reaction to help control our pandemic spread. Okay, and of course you can imagine how this this type of data might be useful at a smaller scale, potentially for contact tracing, also for understanding urban design changes. Of course, the challenge there is data privacy. Equity is a huge issue that we need to think about how we're evaluating as we go through these mobility transitions. And in America right now, we have multiple challenges regarding equity with the Black Lives Matter movement in full steam at the same time as the coronavirus pandemic. So these are three different approaches to think forward about equity in mobility transitions that might be helpful not only now but in the future. First, of course, is asking the community members. Everyone's definition of equity might be context dependent, and a definition in one country or location isn't necessarily applicable to others. Second is think about income and other measures of equity that we can compare quantitatively to look at access to destinations as a key driver of opportunity. And then third is to rethink police enforcement of our transportation systems. It has typically been one of the bedrocks of safety, at least in the United States, but we need to rethink what that means for the future. And this is a good opportunity to consider it. What do I mean by asking community members? Well, first of all, if we're talking about long-term mobility transitions, it's logical that youth need to be the focus of those engagements. Okay, they literally are the future, and so some of these changes might be long-term coming in the future. Second is to find the local experts within the community to help define what equity means for mobility in that community. An expert perspective in one city might not mean the same in rural locations or throughout different cultures. And so we have to start here before we think about what quantitative or qualitative approaches we can use to evaluate those impacts. And then we talked a little bit about co-production, and I would offer that when we are finding different ways to co-produce planning ideas through digital crowdsourcing methods or others, then it also creates an opportunity to evaluate equity and promote equity. And so the image on the right is an online map-based suggestion method for Boston, Massachusetts, similar to the ones that I used with Zhengfeng Zhao on that recent paper looking at the equity impacts of whether or not cities, both New York and Chicago, were actually listening to people's suggestions. When they provide digital data, we can evaluate whether or not we actually implemented, in this case, bike share stations where people asked them. Okay, so we need to evaluate that spatially and quantitatively as well. And then finally, we need to think about different ways to translate this online engagement for offline audiences. That, of course, can mean languages, but it can also mean being able to bridge the digital divide for people that don't have access to online methods. And so one approach is not adequate to be able to engage community members. So that's another key issue to think about. So quantitatively, we can think about breaking apart communities in terms of low income and high income and look at their accessibility with different transportation modes and services now and in the future. This is a public transit that Ipek Chenier and I reviewed in 2016 is an important part of access to these destinations. And so we looked at transit data, breaking it apart in lower by income across the United States, and found that we had, in many cases, because of a broader and more frequent transit service in the Atlanta region in Georgia, we had much less of a difference between high income and low income communities as we did in Seattle and in Seattle, Washington, and in Austin, Texas regions. And so these kind of quantitative measures can help us take a macro view, but they can also be reapplied at different scales to help us see whether particular transportation technologies are actually serving the communities that we want them to, and be able to measure differences between those groups. And that can be done based off of wage or whatever equity measures are applicable in your area. And then third is that we need to rethink street enforcement. Okay, enforcement is one of the 5 E's of planning for healthy bicycling and walking in communities, but that's being re-looked at right now, where people are recognizing that racism in our communities and within our police forces creates inequities in how we do enforcement in the streets. And of course, so when people of color that are experiencing racism in environments don't experience what we would call safe streets or open streets the same, because when there is racism, we can't expect that that experience between different racial groups to be experienced the same. And so we have to examine these cases with an equity lens and think about how we can create safe street environments for all communities that may require different levels of enforcement. We need to think about how we can use urban design and planning to prevent some of the challenges that we think might lead to needing the type of police services that we do in some areas. And one of the main ways that we need to rethink this going forward is through public input, that we need to look at opportunities for public input with and for our communities first before we jump to prescriptions about what might work in individual contexts. Okay, let's start to step out about how we apply some of these lessons and thinking forward first. You know, what can we do now and soon versus what are our longer structural changes that we can implement to be able to improve health and equity during mobility transitions. First is that instead of just thinking about how we can develop slow streets or open streets quickly, how can we increase the speed at which we do quality participation to help guide when, where, and how these different urban transitions happen, whether they're serving physical distancing for COVID or other tactical urbanism purposes. Longer term, we need to rethink our public engagement laws. Sometimes they're set in the past and don't necessarily serve our communities now and in the future. And we need to take a close look at and what's required and what we need to do to make our urban communities better and stronger in the future. Second is we need to think about as opposed to user base, have gone to free public transit and are offering subsidized or free bike share systems, physical contact for these modes, like paying with kiosks or at transit station and interactions with bus drivers, for instance, but then also as an equity action, recognizing that a lot of people are out of work right now due to the pandemic. Longer term, we need to rethink who is allowed to lead some of these transitions towards mobility as a service. And I would offer that some of the more of the planning and permitting might ought to go to transit agencies who are actually equipped to think about how mobility as a service might best be a partner with public transit as opposed to a competitive service going forward. I think both public transit and private operated mobility as a service are here to stay, and we need to find ways to make them work better together. And then, of course, in thinking about data, we need to ensure that the mobility data that we're getting private and is safe, but is also available to researchers and to governments to be able to best manage our COVID crisis. This can be helpful not only for, you know, like we showed in the example of Facebook data that looks at broad range mobility, but also potentially even for micro scale mobility and even contact tracing. So these data sources are a tremendous opportunity for us, but we need to be able to work through security and privacy to be able to protect the users. Longer term, we need to rethink how we develop data standards and coordination, where typically right now, private companies have the upper hand in terms of what gets provided and how to our communities. We could use more government leadership potentially to be able to improve both security and access, safe access to this data longer term. But it needs to be done in partnership, of course, with data providers who are often private. So I'm offering you more questions than answers, but I hope that I can offer 3 specific questions as we work through these mobility transitions that will be helpful in thinking about our communities in the future. First of all, we need to think about how urban obduracy impacts our action on COVID and later disruptions. This won't be the last change. This doesn't, COVID isn't impacting the major changes to our communities short and long term through the overarching challenges related to climate change, for instance. Now's the time to think about what urban obduracy looks like in our own communities versus the changes that we're seeing. Second, what socio-technical changes might come through related to COVID-induced social and economic changes? Again, thinking of Gill's socio-technical windows of opportunity in considering, what of these changes might positively impact our communities and how can we best leverage them to do so in the future? And then third is co-production a way through some of the deadlocks that we see in terms of our required traditional public participation methods versus what we actually need, and some of the bureaucracy where government in many cases is too slow to react to benefit our communities. So perhaps there's another way that we can rethink our participation and provide a more action-oriented opportunity for local community members. And to wrap up, I wanted to offer this sort of perennial quote from Twitter that took place at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting. And it says the favorite quote in this panel about equity and technology is that, Sandy Rosenblum said, when we have places without sidewalks, it seems silly to be thinking about driverless cars and buses. And so I'd challenge each of us what our real needs are on the ground in our communities. And I'm proud to share this, that Sandy Rosenblum was a member of my dissertation committee, and so I consider a great mentor. And she, of course, is the lady on the right in this image. Okay, these are the references. If you wanted to read further based upon what we talked about a little bit today. And I look forward to communicating with you both in the question and answer session now and in the future as well. So let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. We have already a couple of questions in Q&A session, so I think you can read them. So I will let you answer the questions, and then if we have more.
Certainly. The first that we have here is, can open streets become a permanent solution post-COVID to improve air quality, mental health, and public health for pedestrians and bicyclists? Great question. That's certainly one that cities all across the globe are wrestling with right now because open streets have been implemented in so many different places. Part of the reason that I offered those 3 concepts is to think more broadly about, what might actually impact whether or not the open streets can be a core concept where we're going to see this differently in different communities. Some people's mental notions of what a city should look like might be more fixed in some places than others, and I would suggest that where cities that have experienced recent change in their physical infrastructure, which quite frankly may be related to available income and in expenditures related to public works might impact whether or not people see their urban environment as being flexible or not. Okay, and so that could create new challenges for equity, where maybe there are great developments being planned and implemented throughout different communities, but the uptake of those ideas are going to be differential, and some of the communities that are most likely to be able to adopt them in the long term could also be those with the most resources. And so that's an equity challenge, and that's a potentially a structural governance challenge, which, you know, quite frankly relates to taxation, right? We have different levels of financial support in public works systems to be able to make some of these temporary changes permanent at different levels in different countries, right? Those with more home rule and more local taxes might be able to implement quick actions related to these tactical changes due to coronavirus. In other areas where there's a more of the control is at the federal or at the state levels, there might be more, you know, governmental bureaucracy and resistance to change, despite calls for action from local communities. And so those are some of the dimensions that we need to think about, again, both towards short-term immediate changes and the role of co-production in making those happen from local community members, but also long-term changes as well. And let's see, I'm going to switch over here. Okay, the next question is about the relationship of placemaking and mobility. So we have a lot of different opportunities to be able to rethink this relationship between, you know, our streets for transportation, or are they for destinations and living life, right? So we're seeing that change right now, where a lot of cities are not just thinking about, oh, well, we've got an opportunity to expand a sidewalk or a bike lane, but let's think about public space. And so one of those opportunities for quick change that cities are doing right now that I think is an exciting social but also economic opportunity during coronavirus is for restaurants to make space and use space, take space within the streets for physical distancing so that they can stay open and create destinations in places that were typically previously allocated solely for might be a way to begin that transition of urban obduracy mentally, so that people, while they experience their streets in a new way during coronavirus pandemic, might be rethinking what the street should be in the future. And so that's definitely a great opportunity. And there's opportunity for public art in the same way. So as we reallocate street space temporarily, we can look to artists and designers to make these spaces better. Even if those changes are only temporary, they may change a more important impact, and that's people's mental experiences of those places. And then, of course, active street movement. Do we think that these will be more popular than before? We are already seeing, you know, through some of the data that I shared, that we are seeing an increase in bicycling and walking in communities, but we don't know exactly how pervasive these are. So in far-flung suburban locations and exurban locations with limited opportunities for safe bicycling and walking, I would suggest that we're probably not seeing these kind of impacts there. And so we also don't have the data infrastructure and those machines that do the counting available in those areas. So there's a lot of information that we're missing, and we need more counters to be able to evaluate that. However, people are experiencing this change and they're developing new habits. And so for those working in the transportation demand management field, that is finding ways to create more options for people to travel other than driving alone. A lot of the theories, you know, coming from psychology relate to behavior change, suggest that when people change their habits temporarily and then through either choice or being forced to change those habits through as long as 1 or 2 weeks, that those can more likely become permanent changes. And so there's definitely an opportunity there. However, I think some of the data sources that I offered, you can take a look at and watch longer term, and we'll be able to answer these questions in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah. We have one more long question.
Yes, thanks. From Angela, who I understand is one of our direct connections, literally by having a role at both UTSA and Eastern Mediterranean University. Great to meet you, if digitally. Look forward to hopefully one day meeting you in the future in person. She asks, would you consider co-production to be a PC, that's a politically correct term for tactical urbanism, like guerrilla gardening? She offers several other questions, so I'm going to try to break this down a little bit. I may have conflated some of these concepts, and so I want you to think of them separately. They're not necessarily the same, okay? And I don't think of it as politically correct term. I want you to think of co-production as a different mode of engagement, that it's not necessarily about action. It's not necessarily about citizens doing something that is not condoned, but rather that it can be in partnership. But some of the examples that we're seeing right now, due to the quick action and the real challenges in governance that we're faced with during coronavirus, happen to be tactical. Okay, and so Angela, I would offer that even though we're seeing co-production on the streets right now as tactical urbanism, that in the longer term, when we're not faced with these challenges in America and around the globe, that we're going to see new opportunities to rethink what that means. And that could be, you know, citizens and local groups working together, asking urban planners and designers questions about what's possible and what's reasonable, rather than necessarily focusing on the classic engagement opportunities afforded by public meetings. Okay, and so it's a new way of engaging outside of traditional public meetings and collaborative governance, not necessarily just tactical urbanism. I think of it as a much broader conceptual idea, an umbrella for thinking about ways to engage with community members in urban planning. So we see tactical urbanism right now. Her second part of the question is, you know, what do we see as the differences between these? I suppose I've covered that just a little bit, and the degrees of long-term acceptance. So this certainly is a big opportunity for those that are thinking about re-envisioning streets, for sure. We are seeing how that plays out, but we're also seeing a lot of pushback in communities, and I think for very good reason. That's part of why I focused on equity and gave examples of what we're seeing in America and beyond our shores on the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Equity is not experienced the same way in different locations by different groups, okay? And so tactical changes in urban streets does not change underlying symptoms and problems of racism, and so we have to address those first and systematically before we can expect long-term positive change from tactical urbanism. Okay, so we need to engage in those issues first. And in terms of those degrees of long-term acceptance and seeing how these things actually, if you look across different tactical urbanism opportunities that we're seeing for public space during coronavirus, they're very different in terms of their obduracy, their firmness in the environment, even if they're implemented by individuals, right? We had the example from Portland with the PE teacher using chalk and traffic cones and a handmade sign. That's a very lightweight temporary solution, all the way to publicly sanctioned removal of large concrete barriers into the street. I would suggest that how these actually play out might actually have an impact on whether or not they have long-term impacts. For instance, it takes real resources to move those concrete barriers out of the street after they've been put in. It takes money and it takes time and it takes cranes, right? And so some of those more permanent solutions, even if they were tactically placed, might have a longer term impact. And that might be related to the way that people perceive urban obduracy, right? right? Those are physical changes in their environment that they'll see as more permanent. That's my theory anyway. But it's fascinating to take a look at that. So, and those are great questions. Moving to another question, we have how is the fear of using public transit impacting mobility besides the decrease in ridership? Well, I think we can offer that the kind of fear and understandable fear within our communities and even globally as a reaction to COVID is not just temporary, it has long-term impacts, right? People are learning from this experience and they're thinking about what they perceive as clean versus not clean. And that can contribute potentially to a stigma for public transit moving forward. On one hand, I'm heartened by some of public transit's reactions to this. They're being proactive in terms of telling people what their actions are and how they can best protect themselves while using public transit. Of course, just particularly recognizing that a lot of people don't have opportunities to use private transit, right? They're bound to use public transit, so this is an important equity issue as well. The city of Austin, for instance, right now is transitioning physically all of their seats from cloth seats to vinyl. They describe that as an upgrade. I'm not a huge fan of vinyl myself. I was thinking it as an upholstery upgrade, but certainly during coronavirus and thinking about cleanliness, it absolutely is, right? It makes sense that they'll better be able to use disinfectants, and that whether or not those things actually change virus transmission rates, of course, remains to be seen. But if people's public perceptions of that as a better solution and a cleaner solution, it's going to be an opportunity, you know, for people to have trust in the public transit system. Okay, and so how transit systems are communicating those changes going forward is important. We need to also be thinking and being critical about other transportation modes as well. Of course, ride hailing, and of course, our largest public transit system that's almost exclusively privately operated is air travel, right? So this is a big opportunity for people to think about what public transit even means, and then what the role of government is in ensuring the safety of the passengers. So that's a public and a private responsibility right now. And I'm not just talking about making people feel or think that it's safe. I'm talking about actual actions and science as fast as possible so that we can reassure the safety of people in using public transit systems, regardless of mode. And I think that also gets to your second question of making sure that those that are relying on public transit are okay and not infected with COVID, right? That's another great example of how equity is a huge issue. So broadly, not just in the changes that we create through tactical urbanism, open streets, and the way that we perceive the urban obduracy of our environments, but also in how we operate our public transit systems. Making sure that, for instance, in San Francisco, where they've had to increase their bus service to such a high degree to support physical distancing, that they've created, in some cases in downtown, 2-minute headways. That is 2 minutes between each bus instead of often 10 minutes between each bus. So they're having to put extraordinary costs and resources and drivers to be able to provide physical distancing, but that comes at a cost to the agency, right? They may have to decrease service in more rural areas and suburban areas and perhaps low-income areas. So as governments are struggling to transition quickly to be able to safely serve the public, they're also creating new challenges for equity that we can't simultaneously evaluate at the same time because the changes are happening so quickly. So in many cases, you know, we researchers love to think and analyze things long term, but if ever there were an opportunity, we have to act now, and we have to evaluate it simultaneously and also look at long-term impacts as well. And many of your questions have addressed some of these issues in that way. Angela asks another question about how much pushback can be anticipated from transportation unions like taxi drivers when people adopt active modes or public transportation after changing their day-to-day patterns. I've been seeing that pushback happen in two ways, frankly. It's not from the users of these systems, but also from the providers. And that fits in basically similar ways, whether that's public transit from ride hailing or taxi service operator. They are in many ways operating in a very high risk environment, of course, for both their own support of themselves and their families, but also for the public. They have a commitment to their career that they've chosen as well, and so we have to appreciate that and also do everything that we can as a community to be able to support their safety. We are seeing initial reactions from transit unions pushing back to be able to provide more support for those drivers. But of course, we expect those to be different in very different contexts. In America, and I'm sure in much of the rest of the world, we have very wide different representation in different communities. In some cases, transit operators are almost fully represented by a transit union that is very powerful. In many cases, there's absolutely no representation whatsoever, and particularly for ride-hail operators who don't even have the protections of an employee throughout most of the United States. They lack federal support and state support as well, as they're treated as independent operators and contractors currently under those laws. And so that again points to what I referenced before in terms of quick action changes. So executive orders that we're seeing in many places at different levels of government to try to support health and operation as many communities are attempting to reopen safely to foster economic productivity. But at the same time, pushback and reaction against that, recognizing that at least I've heard reports of a greater level of risk to those that are having to work out in the communities, like our drivers, that are in similar contexts to healthcare workers in terms of exposure to the public. So we have to protect them. And the second part of that question circles back to these issues as well of thinking about whether the power holders will try to restrict newly adopted modes of transportation. So of course, we're seeing major equity challenges play out all across the globe. And in the United States, part of what I've seen, both from public reports and in individual actions, is that these technological service providers, or TNCs, or technology or transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, already have a tremendous amount of cash on hand through venture capital and their revenue sources to be able to lobby and manage change, whereas we have less and less support, of course, for independent operators and in many cases public transit. And so some thinkers are considering that a lot of the changes during coronavirus pandemic is going to facilitate rapid economic change in the hands of those that already have power and capital. And so those are some issues that we can look at going forward. I don't think I can offer quick or easy solutions for those matters, right? That's why they're structural. But I do hope that the concept of co-production is one that helps us think about how we can balance quick action as individuals and communities with partnerships with government and helping both staff and elected officials rethink what's possible in terms of urban planning and design. You mentioned particularly about the pushback in San Antonio against e-scooters on sidewalks. We're going to continue to see challenges between different modes, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's one that really highlights that concept of socio-technical transition, right? We have a new innovation that happened. The e-scooter is not a new invention. I should have perhaps included an image which many of you might have seen of an early 1900s electric scooter, right? It was a battery operated scooter, just like we have today, perhaps a little bit heavier than the latest design. But the technology is not new. It's just that we have these transitions, such as the smartphone technology, that allows us to easily find and share that technology that has actually supported longer term change. And of course, that comes with economic impacts as well. And so I hope that you have that as another take home that we have today, recognizing that it's a combination of social change with technology change that actually leads to these longer term impacts to our communities. Okay, we as planners and urban designers love to think that we have a change making role, but over the years I've become more meek, but also more optimistic in terms of what we can do. Even if our individual plans for a sidewalk or for a bike lane or for more equitable access in a low-income community don't necessarily play out, I do like to think that the arc of change is positive, bending towards justice, towards logical solutions that will benefit our communities now and in the future. And so it's up to us. We play a major role as influencers in our communities, as planners and urban designers. And I hope that some of the thinking and discussion that we've had today is helpful for you as you work in your own communities.
Thank you. Okay, I'll send myself a bye. Thank you very much. Of course, I've been listening to you, and it's very strange for us where we are hosting this webinar in Cyprus, where we don't have, I shouldn't say any, but very limited amount of public transportation, and mobility is only dependent on private cars, which is somehow similar to the US cities, I believe, because everybody has got cars and they rely on, private car vehicle mobilities mostly. And this brings us the question of behavior, the user behaviors in cities. Are we going to change our behaviors? Are we going to learn to more cycle, more walking, using more transit-oriented or public transportation, etc.? This is of course another topic, I should say, to be discussed. But whatever the planners or urban designers or transportation planners do, there is always the user side of it. Are we ready to change our habits? Are we ready to go further to, this COVID period has taught us or has let us think about many different things at the same time, socially, psychologically, environmentally, this and that. So I think considering mobility and transportation, there is, as individuals, like ordinary individuals, there are things that we have to reconsider, and then our reconsiderations will take the scientific data, the academic sayings or professional inputs into more reality. But we all need to think about things over and over. This is what I would like to say as a contribution.
Absolutely. I think that coronavirus pandemic has offered a little bit of a chink in the people's perceptions of the obduracy of our transportation systems, right? We're all trying new things, but this happens at a moment where the technological improvements are offering a lot of the same opportunities, where people are rethinking from a one mode choice to a multi-mode choice, that they don't necessarily think about, I have one way that I like to get to a place, but in fact, in many cases, it takes more than one mode to get to a destination at all right now. And so that breaks away some of people's previous conceptions of what was required and potentially what is possible. And so where we don't have public transit systems built out, we see new technologies that are able to support quick use of multiple modes, whether that's e-scooter, ride hailing. People are using technology to be able to navigate new ways to be able to get to their destinations instead of just choosing one. So I'd agree that this is certainly an opportunity to rethink public habits, but that it's supported by, of course, the force of the pandemic, in addition to the new technologies that have wider scale adoption than ever before.
Yeah. So that will be the end of our webinar, I believe, for today. I would like to thank Greg Griffin to be with us and to share his views and research and ideas during the pandemic. And I from different parts of the world, and say goodbye. If you want to say something as last words, Greg.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure to be able to speak with you all today and take this opportunity to think about how we can leverage changes that we're seeing towards positive impacts in the future.
Well, thank you all for joining, and hope to see all of you in our next Public Space Talk series. Goodbye, and stay safe.